The title I chose for this week is When Jingles Replace Doxology, referring to advertising jingles versus doxology is interpreted or defined as liturgical praise to God. And that starkly gives us the contrast that Brueggemann wants to develop here, and the sense of indignation at what has actually been done to our culture and to the Christian religion in particular. Chapter 1 is entitled The Alternative Community of Moses. And here he says, the language of the empire is surely the language of managed reality, of production and schedule and market. Doxology is the ultimate challenge to the language of managed reality. And this again is the choice, in his view, between empire and submission to empire, and doxology, the praise of God, the freedom of God. So he talks about our present situation. He says that the contemporary American church is so largely enculturated to the American ethos of consumerism that it has little power to believe or to act. And he mentions that this applies to both left-leaning and right-leaning churches. So it applies to, in other words, both social justice type churches and fundamentalist or conservative evangelical churches. And the reason why he would say this is because both of them, in his view, oftentimes bow down too fully to some version of materialism. In the case of the right-leaning evangelical or fundamentalist churches, this is really clear, even in their architecture lots of times, and the way that they present themselves is very commercial and very much about marketing. But and they, of course, they bow down to a sort of faith in capitalism. In the case of the social justice or left-leaning churches, oftentimes it's because their focus is still on material things primarily. They're into politics in a big way. They're particularly into economic justice and identity politics. He says that there is a loss, the cause of this is a loss of identity through the abandonment of the faith tradition. So he's really throwing down the gauntlet there, that the Christian church, particularly in America, has lost or abandoned is a more aggressive term, the faith tradition. Liberals, he says, are too chic to remember that. It's not sophisticated enough. Who really believes in the biblical stories and so on? Conservatives, he says, have overlaid the faith memory with all kinds of hedges that smack of scientism and enlightenment. And those are, I guess, probably fighting words for the people they're aimed at. But when a lot of attention is paid, for instance, to the historical Jesus, or to proving that creation happened in 7 days, or the dinosaurs weren't real, or all of this, there is a scientism there. There's kind of like an unacknowledged bowing down to or submission to the criteria of modernity within those very defenses. So I believe that's what he's referring to. He also says liberals are good at criticism but lack vision and promise, whereas conservatives future well, that is, they imagine futures well or kind of project into the future with promises, but they repel real criticism. Particularly in the biblical sense in both cases, the liberals don't think about the future in biblical terms. They think of it in terms of economic policy and political change. Conservatives may view the future in biblical terms, in a very eschatological sense, Jesus coming back and changing everything, but they are loath to criticize the current order. The crisis, he says, boils down to a domestication of vision, attempt in both corners to make it into what they want it to be so that it validates their preordained values. He says we have become insensitive to the radical and revolutionary social reality that emerged because of Moses. And so there he goes into the story of Moses and how Moses brings forth this break from the static religion of the Egyptians that validates power. Now, that whole story for Brueggemann is about Moses with God bringing forth the people from this static religion, from the dominance of the Egyptian religion. Moses is the founder of a new community, and this new community goes out into the wilderness, and it has to continually come back to its ultimate source, God. It also has to constantly formulate how it's going to govern itself and how it's going to live. So with the intervention of a Moses, the breaking away of the power and the static gods and so forth, comes this possibility of community, of new community. So he says of Moses that his work is nothing less than an assault on the consciousness of empire. Brueggemann says, only in the empire are we pressed and urged and invited to pretend that things are all right, either in the dean's office or in our marriage or in the hospital room. I like that quote because every once in a while Brueggemann reminds us that this is all very relevant for today, and that we are too often inclined to submit and to bow down in our particular situation. So in the dean's office, in our marriage, in the hospital room, in the courtroom, in the management meeting, whatever it may be, this is what we do. And the intervention of this prophetic way of thinking can pose a threat to the static way of thinking that supports the power structure. He says, by the middle of the plague cycle, Israel has disengaged from the empire, cries no more to it, expects nothing of it, acknowledges it in no way, knows it cannot keep its promises, and knows that nothing is either owed it or expected of it. That is like the worst fear of the empire, is a consciousness that's separate from the consciousness of the managers, of the people who are in power and in control. And that gives people a separate footing from which they can begin to think and formulate how they want to form their own community. So chapter 2 kind of builds on these insights. It's entitled Royal Consciousness, Countering the Counterculture. Now, he particularly picks on King Solomon and the history of King Solomon. And I'll just read a little bit of this to give some context here, because he's going to argue that from King Solomon on, the people of Israel themselves adopted the royal consciousness and abandoned the Moses founding. So he says, by the time of Solomon, in approximately 962 BCE, after 40 years of shrewd and ambitious leadership from David, there was a radical shift in the foundation of Israel's life and faith. While the shift had no doubt begun and been encouraged by David, the evidence is much clearer and unambiguous with Solomon. The entire program of Solomon now appears to have been a self-serving achievement with its sole purpose of self-securing of the king and dynasty. It consists of what Albergo Sagan calls a program of state-sponsored syncretism, which of course means the steady abandonment of the radicalness of the Mosaic vision. All right, so with Solomon, you get this pagan-like king. So in Brueggemann's vision, or in his interpretation, paganism takes over at this point and kind of invades the body of the Judaic vision. So its features include the king has a harem so that he can guarantee that he will proliferate into the future, a system of tax districts to establish top-down control over the empire, a large bureaucracy for the same reason, a standing army so that the people don't have a direct, palpable stake in the war footing of the empire. He says a fascination with human reason, which became sort of a faith in the power of human reason, and conscripted labor for massive building projects. And he notes in here that many of these elements are kind of almost proto-enlightenment elements, but he doesn't go into that further. But there's a resonance between some of these elements and the much later enlightenment dominance of nature mentality. So there's affluence as one of the characteristics of the Egyptian empire, but that affluence is asymmetrical. The people who are in power experience the affluence and they don't want to change it. But the asymmetry, the fact that the majority don't experience it, but are rather serving it and providing it to the minority, results in a lack of unity. Therefore, a lack of community. Community is broken. There is an oppressing those who built houses. This is a quote. I think it might be from the Bible, but he doesn't cite. But those who built houses and did not live in them, who planted vineyards and did not drink their wine. That's very poignant. It describes clearly the difference between the haves and the have-nots in Egyptian society. It's got a static religion with full-on idolatry of state-sponsored symbiotic gods. Symbiotic, by that I mean that the gods support the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh and all of his money and power support the gods. And so anytime there's a situation in which, say, Judeo-Christianity or the Christian church is closely associated with political power, which it has been in the United States for decades, then what Brueggemann would say about this, and I find this fully convincing, is that's full-on idolatry. It's the substitution of the freedom of God and God's authority for the authority of the empire, the Pharaoh, and the political powers that be. This is the most powerful political message that Brueggemann has to give us. When this happens, God becomes on call. He's on call for those who have money and power. And God is called upon to validate that power, to validate the extension of imperial power. God is treated like a slot machine that you can put contributions into, and out will crank benefits. And indeed, benefits come in the form of political and social support. Imperial power in this situation with God on its side can become pretty impervious to criticism, Brueggemann says. In fact, it becomes very used to simply ignoring what criticism exists. And with ignoring it comes this sort of gaslighting type of phenomenon. Brueggemann doesn't use that term, but it's a gaslighting phenomenon nonetheless, where the people who dare to criticize second guess themselves because they receive no validation whatsoever, and most people simply ignore what they say. Imperial idolatry is what he calls the religion of imminence. It worships what is imminent, that is, what is here and now. It does not look into the future. It views the king as the source of cosmic and social order. So the king comes to take the place of God, so to speak. As some would say, the Pope during the medieval times took the place of God. Or in many Americans' minds, because of the idea that the president can somehow wave a magic wand and make things happen, the president of the United States takes the place of God. So certainly this is the religion of imminence. It values security and order over justice. And so justice takes a backseat to national security. It equates obedience to power with obedience to God. God and country go together. Patriotism and worshipfulness go together. Brueggemann says, I believe that the possibility of passion is a primary prophetic agenda, and that it is precisely what the royal consciousness means to eradicate. Passion, as the capacity and readiness to care, to suffer, to die, and to feel, is the enemy of imperial reality. Okay, this really resonates with me, because there's something extremely human about the willingness to care, to suffer, to die for what you feel is truly important. And he is saying that this is exactly what the empire tries to suck out of people. It wants them to be fearful. It wants them to bow down so that they can achieve security. It wants them to be numbed and satiated with material things, at least those people who are in a position because of their learning or because of their skills to be able to mount an effective opposition. You want those people to be numbed and satisfied with material objects, with entertainment, and so on. So the last part of this chapter deals with that numbness and satiation. He says the royal program of achievable satiation, which is, material satisfaction, is fed by a management mentality that believes there are no mysteries to honor, only problems to be solved, believes God has no business other than to maintain our standard of living, and imagines that we can live outside of history as self-made men and women. That last one, he hasn't backed up yet, in my view, with his analysis of the text. I'm looking forward to that. It is very much a characterization of our modern situation. All three of these are. Certainly, we are told that we are self-made, and that we can live outside of history or stand outside of history. And this puts the responsibility on us for if things go wrong, for them going wrong, right? And obversely, we are encouraged when we are a success to think that that is entirely our doing, and that we owe nothing to the history that came before us, or to God, or to anything else. All right, so I'll leave you with that sentiment of passion versus satiation.